Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to rise today in support of H.R. 2137, the Federal Law Enforcement and Self-Defense Protection Act. I'd also like to thank Chairman Goodlatte and Ranking Member Conyers for their support of this legislation and their commitment to getting it to the floor today. With their support, H.R. 2137 passed the judiciary voice vote. I also want to thank my friends Congresswoman Gabbard from Hawaii, Congressman Reichert from Washington, and also Congressman Pascrell from New Jersey for joining me to introduce H.R. 2137 and for their strong support of this bill. And finally, I'd like to thank Senator Toomey for introducing the companion legislation in the Senate. I introduced this legislation to provide better protections for the law enforcement officers, and I'm glad to see it moving forward. It is particularly fitting that we consider this bill this week during Police Week. Thousands of law enforcement officers are here from all over the country to commemorate their partners who have fallen in the line of duty and to recognize their sacrifices and contributions, and I want to thank them for their service. Because this is also a special week for this congressman from the 9th District of Georgia, because I am a proud son of a Georgia State Trooper who I know firsthand how hard they work, the sacrifices they make. My brother and I all the chances at life that they had, and I just wanted to thank him because I know when he was off duty as I was growing up, he was no less concerned about protecting the community, and the dangers that are associated with his job didn't stop just because he came home to us. I think this holds true for all law enforcement officers. Our law enforcement officers are highly trained, and they're well aware of their responsibilities associated with their jobs. In light of that training and dangers faced by officers, federal law enforcement officers are typically allowed to carry their firearms 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. You know, it just seems like common sense. Federal law enforcement officers don't cease to be officers when they're off duty. Crime doesn't stop simply because an officer isn't working a particular day. The Federal Law Enforcement Self-Defense and Protection Act recognizes that and takes important steps to ensure that law enforcement officers can better protect themselves. In 2013, the federal government shut down. At least 3 federal agencies determined that the Anti-Deficiency Act required them to forbid their law enforcement officers from carrying their agency-issued firearms or their personally owned firearms authorized by the agency. This interpretation of the law meant that at least 1,800 officers were disarmed. During this time, there are reports confirming that at least one disarmed federal law enforcement officer was attacked while off duty. Fortunately, she was able to get away unharmed, but the incident highlights the real danger that officers face even while off duty. In fact, 2012 alone, more than 1,800 federal officers were assaulted, with 206 sustaining serious injuries. From 2008 to 2011, more than 8,500 federal law enforcement officers were assaulted. And in the last 3 years, 27 federal law enforcement officers have been killed while off duty. The threats and dangers are real. That is why, at a minimum, we should ensure that the policies to protect law enforcement officers are clear and consistent. However, the reports that officers were disarmed inconsistently at other agencies, and it is clear that the policies varied by agency to agency. This level of inconsistency does not make sense, and just as a policy to disarm officers doesn't make sense. H.R. 2137 ensures that it is clear that the federal law enforcement officers can carry their weapons in the event of a lapse of appropriations or an administrative furlough. Under the bill, the officers retain the right to carry their government-issued firearm for personal protection or to respond to a critical incident. Importantly, this bill does not protect those on administrative leave or those who have lost the right to carry. It does not expand firearms carry authority to law enforcement officers who currently do not possess it. But it does ensure that there is a consistent policy for those officers who are able to carry and are furloughed through no fault of their own. The legislation is narrowly tailored, but it has a large impact. H.R. 2137 recognizes that federal officers could be confronted by job-related threats, whether they're on duty or off, and it recognizes that officers need to be able to protect themselves, their families, and their communities. This bill is a bipartisan agreement protecting our law enforcement officers who put their lives on the line to protect us and making sure that it is a priority. This bill is supported by the Law Enforcement Officers Association, the Fraternal Order of Police, and the National Association of Police Organizations. H.R. 2137 is a sign of the recognition that we must do everything in our power to ensure that law enforcement officers have the access to tools they need to protect themselves and the public. And is also speaking as a state trooper's kid, it reminds me that my dad, for all that he did, in the 30-plus years that he worked, he was on duty when he wasn't on duty. This is simply a recognition that all of our officers carry that same trust, and we want to give them the tools to do what they need to do. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.